Hello, I want to give a quick demo of what we showed at the OpenStack Juno Summit in Atlanta on the project Graffiti. This will help us to set some more context for anybody who wasn't able to attend, and also since we had a lot of feedback that people would like to see this kind of thing land in Horizon, as well as a new metadata service in Glance, well, we want to make sure that we can share this out and so it's easily understandable for everybody. So if we jump straight into the UI today, today you have a lot of different types of things you can manage, whether that's volumes or flavors, images, or host aggregates, and all of those provide some way to put metadata on them, whether that's through extra specs, which are key value pairs, or just simple tags. They all give you some way to do that, but what they don't give you is a good way to essentially share that metadata and make it easy to consume, and even to collaborate on it across types of resources. So if you think about your images, your snapshots, your volumes, or if we had application packages, essentially they are a kind of workload. And with that workload, you're going to want to do things like say, I want to associate a category with that workload. So for example, in here, we now have this widget where you can say, I've got various types of metadata that I can put onto say my image. So we've got application categories, whether that's business software or developer tools or software infrastructure, and we can do things like say, this MongoDB image, it's for big data and it's for database, and we can also do things like say, I'd like to say associate a compute architecture or an operating system or something like that. It's also very simple to just say, hey, I know this is x86. I also want to say that this is a CentOS. And so we can just essentially associate that over very easily. And if this was something that was discovered by the system, automatically published in, we're able to read those properties back out and display it in this same widget. Underneath of each of these, if there's properties associated with it that will go down into metadata, we can actually go in and look at that. So you see here's the OS distro, which is a property, and you can see it's got some description of what it actually is. So now it's actually very visible to you, like here's the available fields, and here's what's set in them, and here's information about that. Also down here, if you look at here, you can easily see like additional information about this kind of metadata. So if we save that down, that all gets taken care of and saved down onto the image. So you have your architecture and your OS distro saved appropriately on that image. You can do similar things with volumes. It's just another kind of workload. It's just another kind of thing that you can associate metadata to. So if we come out here and say here's a volume and we want to look at it, and we can see what's on this thing. It's got maybe some various properties. Has some different categories associated with it. And as an admin, you could say, you know what, I want to add some libvirt driver options onto this actual image. These are things that would be, potentially optimize the performance of this image if it was placed on a system that has the libvirt driver, on a host that has the libvirt driver. So if we look at this, that has a bunch of various properties that are associated with it, and now these are discoverable for the admin or whoever is going to be looking at this image and saying, you know what, I need to put on some special properties here to help basically give hints to the driver of what it needs to do. So again, what this is doing is just making this kind of information readily available and usable for the admin here looking at these images. So now I've put categories and various things on these volumes and on these images. I can come back and say, you know what, I'd like to manage my flavors and say if I've got some flavors that are capable of launching workloads of a type of category, then I can simply come in here and say, hey, here's this flavor. You know what, I'd like to put on this flavor also that it's good for, let's just say databases. It's also maybe good for big data. And you know what else? Maybe we want to look in here and see what else it might apply to. And we're creating a flavor that we'd like to say is good for encryption. So say, okay, we're going to put encryption on here. So now we basically said this flavor has these capabilities or these categories on it. And we can now put additional metadata on there that's going to say this flavor when it launches, if I have, say, the compute capabilities filter in there, I want to make sure that it has, say, the AES encryption set associated with it. Because if I'm going to say this is in a category of encryption, I want to make sure that that feature is actually enabled on my CPU for the host that this gets launched on. And if we save that down, it takes care of, again, setting things like, hey, the capabilities, CPU info features has this AES encryption set associated with it. So where this all comes back together is when you're going to launch your instance. Today, we have this launch instance UI. There's a better one in progress, but we want to incorporate these concepts in there as well. I could come in here and say, you know what? I want to fire off a workload for databases. I also, I'm interested in one that's big data, and I see it's getting filtered down. And then you could say, I'm also one that is good for encryption. And this allows us to actually find a flavor that's going to provide the capabilities that we're looking for. Similarly for boot source. So if I'm actually got images and snapshots or volumes, and I'm looking for my database workload, I say, okay, here's my database workloads. Now I'm actually interested in a big data workload. Now I can see that I'm able to easily filter down and find these various types and categories so that I can launch my actual workload. Now, one of the key things here is we're trying to reuse and even in some cases we think we need to enhance some of the metadata capabilities across these resources. But a key thing is when you actually have the metadata catalog available to you across your different types of resources, you can actually drive a UI and you can actually make it a collaborative experience. So you can essentially describe your workload in terms of its categories or things and metadata associated with it. And then you can describe maybe flavors or host aggregates that are capable of hosting that kind of a workload. And so it ties the two together in a very simple manner, but it's also very powerful and makes for a much more user-friendly experience here in the UI where you're no longer searching a wiki or something to figure out what your extra specs are. Rather, you're just using it. And this applies for flavors, images, volumes, host aggregates, any type of resource we think that we could pull up in here. So like even on the host aggregates, you can come in here and say, here's the host aggregate that I would actually like to say is good for my HIPAA workloads, right? And now I've basically put that onto this host aggregate, or maybe I want to put some sort of a trust service assurance associated with this host aggregate. And now you simply save this down and it takes care of getting that metadata down onto that host aggregate. So if you want to have a workload that you don't need to have some HIPAA compliance in terms of what host it gets landed on, then you could put the same properties onto, say, that image or that application and be able to ensure that it gets launched onto these hosts. So one of the things that's important is that we've created sample data based off of the compute capabilities filter, and we've also created some sample catalog or categories, I should say. So we're not saying these are the exact categories that everybody should use. Instead, we want there to be a service where you can actually define these categories for yourself in your environment so that they make sense to you. Maybe we'll have an example set of categories that we can ship with, and that's fine. But we also want to be able to say, you want to be able to define your own categories. So we want a service that can essentially host this metadata definitions and then make it visible out to the different kinds of resources that it can apply to. And so, for example, this is a UI that we built on top of it, of the REST API that we're looking at. And we can add new categories. We can do things like put names and descriptions. Now, if you actually want this to be something that goes into properties, you should be able to basically add your own properties and expose those out with their various types of constraints. And this is all just to help an in-cloud administrator maybe create his own essentially his own set of metadata that he'd like to share. And the key is that it should all be via a service API that's backing it, and that we have essentially a standard format that people can use to expose this up. And that's what we would use to drive our widget in the UI. So to that end, we are looking at refining on that widget, but we do need somewhere to serve this out of. And we've gotten a lot of feedback that the Glance metadata service would be a great place to host this. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. And we'll be sending out more info on that shortly. Thanks a lot.